everybody.
Hello.
Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, Dr. John Dominic Crossan joins us once again. How are you doing, Dr. Crossan?
It's very fine, Jacob. Nice to be back with you.
Well, let's get started. So today we're talking about your book, God and Empire, Jesus Against Rome, Then and Now. So what are the early views on the kingdom of God? I know that you talk about that a bit in the book, and you also talk about his ambiguity of power. Could you explain that to the audience?
Well, to take a run at it, back in the book of Daniel, written, in about the 150s, 160s BCE, it's set way back before that, but it was written in the 160s. In chapter 2 and chapter 7, you can read them for yourselves. Empires don't come off very well. Chapter 7, for example, the great empires of the Babylonians, the Medes, and the Persians are not even like human operations at all. They're like wild beasts from the sea. The sea being sort of the primordial otherness to our land-based humanity, as it were. So they're not even human. And the Fourth Empire, the one of Alexander the Great, the kind of stutter to come up with any sort of an animal, a bear, a tiger, a leopard, something that's worthy, and they can't come up with any animal that's as ferocious as Alexander's phalanxes. So empires basically are not considered human. And then, of course, you have what you might call the empire of God, or the kingdom of God, using their language, kingdom, God's rule on earth, which is considered to be human. So starting from there, and then, of course, the Roman Empire hasn't even arrived. So if your worst imagination, for example, is Alexander's Hellenistic Empire, and the next biggest thing that comes along is the Roman Empire, well, this God's rule, this kingdom of God, it looks like it's going down, and the empires of earth are going up. And how is anyone listening to what Jesus say, talking about God's rule, when clearly it's Rome's rule? And it doesn't look like Rome, unlike Alexander, is going anywhere, because what Rome took, Rome pretty much kept. So that's the background, or the matrix within which Jesus and Paul and everyone in the New Testament is speaking. It's the Romanization of the world, you might call it, their world.
You say here in the book that Jesus' own proclamation therefore insisted that the kingdom of God was not imminent but present. It was already here below upon this earth. And however it was to be consummated in the future, it was a present already and not just an imminent future reality.
That is basically, thank you for quoting that, Jacob. That is the basic position I have on the historical Jesus after being at it since, I don't know, the early 1970s, that's 50 years ago. What I'm trying to figure out is, without in any way denigrating John the Baptist, what exactly is the difference between John the Baptist's proclamation and Jesus's? I'm not saying which is better. That's all. What's the difference? And we know there's a difference because Jesus, I would consider this historical, started his public life, if you would call it that, by being baptized in the Jordan. Now, let me hold up for a second. As soon as I use the word baptism, I know what everyone's imagining. So let me back up and say what I understand John the Baptist is up to. What he is doing is reenacting the Exodus from Egypt and the return from Babylon. The return from Babylon, when the Babylonian Empire falls, the Persian Empire returns the exiles back to their homeland, sort of under Persian protection. They have to cross the desert. They have to cross the Jordan. They have to come into the promised land. John's great announcement is, what's holding the whole show up? Why isn't God coming? We've been listening to this for 500 years. He's coming, he's coming, he's coming. He's never here. John says it's because of your sins. I'm sure a lot of people must have said, oh, yeah, we heard that. It's always our sins. It's always our fault. Blame the victim. So what John said was, no, here's what we'll do. We'll go out into the desert as if we were returning from exile in Babylon. We'll cross the Jordan, and as the waters wash our bodies, call that baptism, as the waters wash our body, repentance will wash our souls. We'll come up into the promised land as a purified people, and then of course God will come. Now, he was wrong actually, but in any case, that's a gigantic act of hope. It made sense to people. No wonder John was so popular. At least we could do something instead of just hoping, waiting, praying, expecting. All right, that's John. Now, if Jesus was baptized by John, and as I said, I consider John to be an historical character, he's in Josephus too. I think Jesus was baptized by John. We might want to talk about that. It's the acute embarrassment across the four Gospels of that fact. Then Jesus started off as John's disciple. Though we have to accept it, if we don't like it or not. His theology was that of John. He was expecting the imminent advent of God's rule on earth. Now, however, when I begin to hear Jesus in his own voice, for example, when he says, you can almost see the pivot, there is nobody in the whole world greater than John the Baptist, but the whole pivot is on that one word, but the least in the kingdom of heaven in God's rule is greater. That's what you say about a revered mentor with whom you will never disagree or agree. So now, the question I have to ask myself, how could Jesus make such a statement without everyone pelting him with stones? He's saying that God's advent, which we've been waiting for 500 years, and that's a tradition, you're claiming it's here now. Jesus, that's some kind of a cruel joke. That's like somebody saying in Kyiv today, peace has arrived, while the missiles are still arriving. How could Jesus even say that without it being the most malicious joke anyone could tell? Rome is still there. Tiberius is still the ruler, let's say. Antipas, Pilate, they're all the usual suspects are still around. How could he possibly say that? The only way I can understand it, I'm talking now historically, irrespective of whether you agree with it theologically or not. The only way I can understand Jesus is that he's saying, we've got it wrong. We've been waiting for God to do it for us. God has been waiting for us to do it along with God. It's not what you might call an intervention eschatology, to use a fancy scholarly language. It's a collaborative eschatology. It'll never happen. You're waiting for God to do it for you. It'll never happen. God is waiting for you to participate in the program, as it were. That's how I understand the difference between John and Jesus and the challenge of Jesus.
What are your views on Mark chapter 13, when the apocalypse apparently is coming and Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, and they talk about the Son of Man, but the Son of Man in Mark 13 is distinct from Jesus, whereas in the prior chapters, Jesus is identified as the Son of Man.
Well, I don't know how you are so sure in chapter 13, let me start with that he's distinct from the Son of Man that we've been listening to the whole time. Go back to Daniel 7 for a moment. As I said, the empires are like beasts. The God's rule is like human. The Son of Man is simply a patriarchal way of saying what we would say male or something like that. We would say humanity. The empires of earth are beastly. God's empire, God's rule is human. So, Son of Man is simply a patriarchal way of saying human, we would say. That's a better translation. So that's a huge claim. Now, to understand Mark, when Mark says at the beginning, the time is fulfilled, God's rule is here, it's not imminent, it's here. And therefore, of course, the Son of Man, which is God's empire for earth, must be here as well. So it makes absolute sense to me that during Mark is speaking, Jesus is the Son of Man. He brings, as it were, the announcement of the kingdom. The kingdom is here. If I could summarize Mark's manifesto, the kingdom is here, guys. Get with the program. That's what he's saying. And that's what the Son of Man language is all about. Now, let me back up and say, how do I understand Mark? Because when you ask me a question about one chapter, I'm going to answer as I see all of Mark. I understand Mark as a gospel written for refugees, written in the early 70s, maybe when at least Jerusalem has fallen. Jerusalem has already fallen. So it's 71, 72, 73. It's not, as I see it, written in Rome. I don't think that for a word. I think it's written around Caesarea Philippi in the northeastern regions beyond the Jordan, in a predominantly written for Jews, but in a predominantly Gentile environment. And the refugees who have fled from Jerusalem, who have lost everything, maybe even almost lost their faith, you can hear their voices in chapter 13 saying something like, we thought surely at the moment when Jerusalem was going to fall and the temple burned to the ground, then at least Jesus is going to come. And people said, see here, see there. And they were wrong. Jesus didn't come. And Mark has to console them by telling them that's not what Jesus meant. He never said that. He warned you, says Mark post factum, about the fall of Jerusalem. You should have expected that. In fact, Mark probably says he should have been out of Jerusalem in any case. That's the last thing he told you, get out of Jerusalem, back to Galilee. Anyway, so I understand chapter 13 is almost the equivalent of you get in Josephus when he talks about the Jewish hopes that even as the temple was starting to burn, as it were, surely now God will intervene and save us all and destroy the Romans. Of course, Christian Jews thought the same thing, Messianic Jews. And it's their voices that I hear behind chapter 13 as Mark tries to clean up the theology to make them understand what happened.
What are your views on the nativity accounts in Matthew and Luke?
I missed the key word. What are my views on?
The nativity accounts of Jesus in Matthew
Oh,
and Luke.
okay. Gotcha. Basically, if you've ever looked at a ancient manuscript, say a papyrus manuscript from the 1st century, written in sort of this wall-to-wall capitals, uncial letters, no breaks, no headings, no verses, no chapters, not even maybe even paragraph breaks. I mean, your head starts to spin looking at it. I mean, I have to blow it up really big and try and divide up the words to get going in one of those. So it was kind of common sense in the 1st century to put some kind of an introduction. And not just an introduction that says this is about, but a sort of what I would call an overture. And by an overture, I mean it's something that gives you a kind of a summary of what's coming, a glimpse into the whole. Every one of the 4 Gospels has an overture. The overture to Mark, it's Mark 1 to 15, tells the story of John the Baptist. But it's not just to get the story going, because it's a warning that what happens to John the Baptist is going to happen to Jesus. And just the same way as in chapter 6, after he is beheaded, the disciples will come to bury him. That's going to happen to Jesus. This is almost like a prophetic warning. I'd call it an historical overture. It's like a warning of what's going to happen to Jesus, right? let me turn to John. John also has an overture. It's a magnificent one. It's that hymn to the Logos. Logos, by the way, is a Greek word. We translate it as word, and I think that's horrible translation for us. Logos means the intelligibility of the universe, that God has suffused the universe with wisdom, to put it in Jewish terms of the wisdom literature. It makes sense. You should be able to figure out what's going on. And John says the Logos, the intelligibility of the universe, has become incarnate in Jesus. That's a whole overture, because John is trying to tell you not how a man who is also divine looks like a man. He's telling you how somebody who is divine looks like a man, the reverse. He's sort of rewriting the whole synoptic tradition from a more transcendental viewpoint. Now, Matthew and Luke, they have an overture too. They happen to each have I'm going to use the term very carefully, a parabolic overture. Matthew 1 and 2 is the overture to Matthew's gospel and makes absolute sense as the overture to Matthew's gospel. In Matthew's gospel, for example, what we call, it's a horrible title, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is on the new Mount Sinai, acting as the new Moses, giving you have heard, I say. And of course, his nativity is exactly like Moses. He's almost killed by the evil Pharaoh, who's now the evil Herod. And instead of Moses fleeing for safety from Egypt to Israel, where does Jesus flee under the Roman rule of Herod? He flees from Israel into Egypt. It's going the wrong way. So Matthew makes absolute sense to me as a parable, not as history. Of course, Jesus existed. Of course, Mary and Joseph existed. Of course, donkeys existed in Egypt. All the paraphernalia is there, but it's a parable. The whole story of Herod, the Magi, the flight into Egypt is as real as is the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan. It's a parable. And if you don't like parables in the Bible, please take it up with Jesus, who pretty much invented them, or take it up with God. Look at Luke then. Exactly the same thing. It's totally different. Of course it is. It's the overture to Luke's gospel. How could it be the same? Luke's gospel is telling you an overture to his gospel. So the function of those two ones is not to go through them and say, well, how do you reconcile the presentation in the temple with the flight into Egypt? And maybe we can get them all together in the crib. Let's not talk about the slaughter at Bethlehem, because that's not Christmas stuff. Ooh, we don't do blood at Christmas. Let's put the Magi into the crib along with the shepherds. That'll be fine. And let's not ask, if the Magi are being led by the star, why do they have to stop at Jerusalem and ask for directions? Since, first of all, we know that men never stop and ask for directions in any case. So why do we do that? Of course, because otherwise you don't get Herod into the story. If the Magi just come up from the south, come into Bethlehem and go back down or sail out towards the Persian Gulf, Herod won't be in the story. Matthew needs him in the story. So Matthew 1 and 2, Luke 1 and 2, I think are superbly crafted overtures to each to their separate gospel. And any attempt to just harmonize them into one is an insult to Matthew and Luke. And if you think they're inspired by God, it's an insult to inspiration. Understand them in the context as overtures of their own gospels.
You mentioned that Paul, you call him the radical Paul at one point in the book, and then a little bit later. You then refer to him as the liberal Paul. What's going on there?
Probably a confusion in my own terminology, to be honest with you. I'm trying to understand the different sources for Paul. The way I would put it now, the Paul of the 7 authentic letters, I would call the radical Paul. If you want to see the Lucan Paul, the Paul of the Acts of the Apostles, I think I'd be much more inclined to call him the liberal Paul. You're trying to reconcile him in a way with the Roman Empire. For example, every important person, official I'm talking about, who meets Paul almost falls over backwards declaring him innocent. That's true of Paulus in Cyprus. It's true of Gallio at Corinth. It's true of, Festus in Jerusalem. They're all saying he's innocent. It's a perfect storm of innocence, Jacob. I've never seen anyone so innocent from the Roman point of view. He is, of course, innocent from the Christian point of view, but from the Roman point of view, nobody so innocent ever ends up so often in court, in jail, and dead. So I would be inclined to say the process in the New Testament is de-radicalizing and re-Romanizing Paul. So you have the radical Paul of the authentic 7 letters, then you have more the liberal Paul of Luke Acts, who kind of could be reconciled with the empire, and then you get the non-authentic ones like Colossians and Ephesians, which are, I would say, much more like the conservative Paul. And then by the time you get to Timothy and Titus, we're well into the reactionary Paul. So Paul is a problem for them, well, Jesus is a problem too. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the book of Revelation, to be fair. But mostly what's happening after Jesus and Paul, apart from John, is a kind of a softening, diluting of the major challenge, really. And when you're a theologian or a Christian looking at it, it's the job of the historian, to say, this is what Jesus stood for. Now, you can say that, and I think it was totally wrong. I think it's totally right. You can say whatever you want. But the accurate historian should say, this is what Jesus was about. This is what Paul was about. Then you can do judgment, theological judgment. But you shouldn't decide if your theology doesn't like Jesus or does like Jesus, therefore he must be doing what your theology says. No, he's doing what history says.
When do you date the pseudo-Pauline epistles?
Round number 125. What's happening basically in the 2nd century is, on the one hand, you have the apologists writing philosophical apologies. I mean apologies in the technical term, defenses in plain language. Philosophical defenses of Christianity. And then you have the Acts of the Apostles and Luke Acts writing what I would call an historical defense of it. That's what I meant by saying every Roman official bends over backwards to exculpate Jesus or Paul or whoever. So I think the whole process goes on. Paul is dead in the 60s. For the next 50 years or so, it's the first great steps towards Constantine. It's getting Christianity safely adjustable so that by 325, when Constantine looks around and says he knows he needs a religion to hold this great single empire together, one emperor, one empire, one new emperor city. Christianity, of course, not Judaism, because Christianity is already acclimatized fairly strongly to Rome. Constantine would probably look at the bishops and say to himself, that's a good organization. That's like what I have in my army with my generals and my navy with my admirals. That's well organized. That's how to run a religion. That's the religion for me. And I'm not hinting, by the way, he's insincere. That's what makes him absolutely sincere.
How do you look at the theologies of early Christianity and their different views on government and God?
Well, in one sense, we've almost just touched on that. There's 2 elements. If you look at what's behind me right now, I deliberately put up the 2 books. And honestly, Jacob, and for everyone out there, I didn't just stick up rendered unto Caesar because I want that advertised too. from God and Empire in 2007 to Render unto Caesar 2022, the other dates behind my name there, I recognize something happening on two levels. One, we have to bring it out here because you're talking about history, and history didn't stop in the first century or the second century. History is what we're living in. In God and Empire, all I was very much aware of that from the 90s on, there was comparisons being made in this country between the Roman Empire and America as the new Roman Empire. People were saying it sometimes sadly, sometimes gladly. And that's the atmosphere I was writing in. And I was very much aware that the Roman Empire had been a republic, and then it went out and got itself an empire, had a civil war, and ended up, of course, as an empire. It got an empire and lost a republic. And I was wondering, was the same thing happening to us? Now, that's as far as I was seeing. Maybe, we had a republic, we got an empire, we have had a civil war just like the Romans. Ours went 4 years, theirs went 20. Will we lose the republic because of the empire? What I didn't see then, and what I do see in Render unto Caesar, is a far wider comparison between Rome then and America now, in that Rome began with a king. And before it got a republic, let me take away the word king and say autocrat. Rome began with an autocrat, a king. It had to get rid of that to have a republic. Well, we did that too. We had the same problem in Ireland, George III. We got rid of the king and got a republic. Took Ireland a lot longer to do it because the Irish Sea is closer than the Atlantic and the dragoons got there faster. Anyway, we had the same thing. We got rid of a king. America got rid of a king and had an empire, had a republic, and so forth. Now, the danger I see is that we might yet complete the Roman cycle, which is that after you get an empire, have had your civil war and all the rest of it, you go back to having an autocrat. That's the danger I see now in Render unto Caesar that I didn't even glimpse, to be honest with you, in God and Empire. So that's one level. A second level is this. It would be, and let me put it this way, it would be terribly wrong to think that Jesus was not speaking against Rome and that somehow Pilate got the whole thing wrong and made a mistake and just happened to kill him by mistake. And the same thing happened to Paul. And it'd be awfully dumb to think the Roman Empire just kept killing people by mistake. It would be equally fatuous to think they were just against Rome, and once Rome went, everything would be fine. There's running through the New Testament a distinction between two words. I'm going to summarize it as this world and the world. This world is the world of civilization. I'm going a bigger word than empire. This world is the world of civilization, the way the world runs, the way the world works, which means it always has worked by the stronger doing what the strong want and the weak taking what the weak must. It's a quotation from the Greeks. The world. God so loved the world. Well, how can God love the world if this world is so evil? Because this world is the world of civilization, and the world is the world of creation. And there's a clash between them. So behind God and empire, or Paul and empire, or Jesus and empire, is the clash between civilization and evolution. There's a far wider clash going on there. So civilization and creation, or we might well say evolution from the scientific point of view. That's the real challenge of the New Testament. It's not don't be like Rome because God doesn't like Rome. So construct different structures. The far more fundamental one in their language is this world against the world. And then we have to try and figure out today, well, what's the modern equivalent of the world against this world? I only see one out there. Where do we find two worlds? So that's the real challenge of both those books together. And as I see it, it's the challenge of the New Testament.
So, Back Lord of the Four Corners, thank you for your super sticker. Okay. What are your views on the text called Joseph and Asenath? I know you talk about that in the book. And that there are some scholars, some, that think it's some kind of Christian text or proto-Christian text. Well, I know that the majority don't think that. What do you think about it?
I'd be very honest with you. I've never worked with it. I don't know it well, Jacob. I prefer not to how would I put it, propagate my ignorance. No, I much prefer you get an expert on that to talk about it. But I think it is a Jewish text. That's
Did the pseudo-Pauline epistles, were they written after Acts? And if they were they trying to harmonize Acts in any way with the authentic letters of Paul?
I try to wrestle with that. Granted that I'm putting both of them into the 2nd century. Here's the one thing I see about the pseudo-Pauline epistles. All of them begin very much similar like Paul in the epistle. Paul in the apostle. I don't see any evidence in the pseudo-Pauline letters that they deny his apostolicity. You might say they clean up his apostolicity from their point of view, but none of them says he isn't one. And that's exactly what I see in those 3 accounts in Acts, 9, 22, and 26, the 3 different accounts of Paul's conversion from a persecutor to apostle. As he says, that's exactly what Luke denies him. As far as the Acts of the Apostles are concerned, Paul is not an apostle, because an apostle is somebody sent by God and Christ in a revelation, and that makes him equal to the 12 who went with Jesus during his earthly life, and then, of course, saw him in vision after his crucifixion, resurrection. Paul claims, I'm the least of the apostles, the last of the apostles, but that means he's an apostle. That is what Luke denies him. And that's the whole authority and integrity and identity of Paul. So I don't see that denied in the pseudo-Pauline epistles. I do see it denied in the Acts of the Apostles. So I'm not sure absolutely if it's later, but it's certainly more denigrating of Paul. So in one sense, if you're watching Paul being slowly de-radicalized and re-Romanized, I put it after them. Now, I don't know. They could be totally separate, have nothing to do with one another, and just one is more against Paul than the other. But I would put them, if I had to put them in a line, a linear line, I would put the Acts of the Apostles after that, in terms of basically what to deny about Paul. It's a more radical renewal of Paul.
When you look at Paul's letters, and he talks about himself being frustrated at there being other movements, like in 1 Corinthians, says, oh, you follow Cephas, you follow me, you follow that guy or that other guy over there. Then you see the arguments he has in the Epistle to the Galatians. Is he arguing with other Christian communities and also with other Jews? And why, not why, let me rephrase that. What do you think were the views of the other Christians he was coming up against?
Oh, there could be anything, but if I can make a generalization, which needs to be specialized, what Paul is fighting against is what I'm going to call the drag of Roman normalcy. For example, if you look at the problem with the Eucharist at Corinth, it's taken for granted in Roman normalcy that if I'm a householder and I want to give a banquet or a feast or whatever you want to call it, I might have present my amici, my equals. I might also have my freed slaves. I might also have my slaves even present, because that all shows how important I am. Look at my household, how big it is. But the question is, would they all get the same food? And this is an amusing one that Pliny the Elder is writing a letter, I've forgotten to whom, but he's saying that if I had a feast like that with all these different grades of people, I would give everyone the same food. I think it would be impolite to give them different food. And his questioner says, doesn't that bankrupt you? And Pliny says, oh, we've got it wrong. I don't give them all the good food. I give us all the cheap food. So he solves the moral question of, do you differentiate in the feast by giving everyone the cheap wine? So what Paul is up against is the Eucharist, which is a real meal, by the way. It's also a celebratory meal of the justice of Jesus on earth, for which he died, but it also is real food and drink there. And the question at Corinth apparently is, those slightly better, could be shop owners, say, slightly better than, say, workers, day workers, they would like to have the better food. And Paul is trying desperately to keep it by saying, well, if you have the bread first and the wine later, then everyone has to have the same. Everyone has to be there. He is struggling basically with the drag of normalcy. I cannot find a better expression than that. People are trying to say, well, this is the way we've always done it. And Paul has a radical vision. And it's not just radical for himself, it's radical for a lot of his followers. Otherwise, we wouldn't have his letters. I might be wrong in this, but I don't know if Paul would ever write a letter just to say hello. He might. But there's usually more going on in those letters. I think if he wanted to say hello, he'd just tell one of his co-workers, go to the Thessalonians and say hello, tell them all is well. There's enough people coming and going to keep that going. The letters usually bespeak a problem.
I have a super chat question from Nativ Kravitz. Hope I pronounced your name right. What's the relationship of historical anti-Semitism to the New Testament and its worldview? What would you suggest going forward to help heal the chronic problem?
Oh dear. This was something, Nadav, I saw in 1960, because I saw the Passion Play in 1960. It hadn't been on in 1940, obviously. It was on in 1950 with Eisenhower and Adenauer present. I was there with 40 pilgrims in 1960, and I did know the story, and I did know how the story ended. But when I first saw it portrayed as drama, not just read in the text, I began to see how easily, watch my language, theological anti-Judaism could escalate or become the seedbed for historical or racial anti-Semitism. Because there are things, without a doubt, said in the New Testament, even when you're dealing with, say, one type of Christian against another, even internally. There's stuff said in Matthew, for example, which, if I imagine Matthew writing in the 80s and what he's saying about maybe fellow Pharisees, I think they're saying equally bad about him, of course. But we have Matthew, we don't have the opponents. And Matthew puts it on the lips of Jesus. And Jesus says, don't call people names. And a few chapters later, he's busy doing it. So there is theological anti-Judaism. I came back in 1961 to this country, and the first formal article I wrote, that's in a real journal, was called Anti-Semitism and the New Testament. I don't think I said in the New Testament, I said anti-Semitism and the New Testament. And I was talking about the crowd shouting, his blood be upon us and all of that. Having seen the crowd do that on the stage at Oberammergau in fall of 1960, that was in my mind. Reading the text, you mightn't see it, but when you have a whole stage filled and heavy with women and children, by the way, because the men are working or something. So it's latent in there, and it is there is theological anti-Judaism in there, and it can and was and has been in the past the seedbed of racial anti-Semitism.
When you look at the account in Second Corinthians about Paul's flight from King Aretas, the fourth of Nabatea, and the book of Acts talking about a similar flight of Paul, this time from Jews instead of Aretas, do you think in Second Corinthians he could have been fleeing from both?
Listen, Jacob, thank you for bringing that up, because that's where I would almost rest my whole case on understanding Paul. When Paul says he's fleeing, but he tells exactly the same story. You can't forget it. It's his basket escape, his exit strategy, through either through a window or to the wall. And he says, Aretas, we would consider it Aretas the fourth of the Nabateans, is guarding the gates to arrest him. That's what he says in Second Corinthians. And he's kind of laughing at himself, by the way. He ain't boasting, because I think I may have said this before. I don't know if it was with you, but the Romans gave a corona moralis, a wall crown, to the first soldier in over the wall of a besieged city, the first one in. Paul kind of saying, he's chronicling all his disasters. I was the first out, as it were. So he's laughing at himself a little bit, mocking himself. Now, we have the same story, really. It's the same story. He's in Damascus. He's coming through the wall or the window, whatever you want to do it. He's in a basket. And it said the Jews were trying to kill him. And it's mentioned twice. That is what I would consider an act of theological anti-Judaism. I don't think we can really, with a straight face, say, well, he did the same thing twice. He kept the window, so every time he got in and out of Damascus, he went in through the window. Come on. I mean, we shouldn't do that. I mean, that just makes people, that makes history giggle. He escaped from Damascus. I think Aretas, who kind of descends from heaven, all of a sudden, he fits perfectly. Aretas the fourth, as far as we can understand it, pushed to take Damascus in the year 36. Philip, who ran the Transjordan, the northeastern Transjordan we talked about, had just died. Antipas and Aretas got into a war, and they got into a war at Gamla. What's Aretas doing in Gamla, east of the slightly northeast of the Sea of Galilee, when his capital is down at Petra? He's pushing northward to take Damascus. And Paul's days are limited, because Paul is a Jewish missionary at the wrong time, in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing. And he better get out of there fast, because Aretas' authorities are now taking Damascus. So all of that makes absolute sense to me. And the Jews guarding the gates of an Arab city, no way. And able to kill Paul? Okay, in the Roman Empire, you might get away with a lynching. You might get away with it, possibly Stephen. But if any Jewish authorities had put Paul to death, Rome would not have accepted that. They didn't accept it when an Ammonite high priest did it to James of Jerusalem in 62. Rome had a monopoly on executions. Nobody else got to do it, thank you very much, legitimately. So I would never reconcile them. I would not reconcile them. It's an act of disrespect to the text, actually. Luke is changing the one word that's important for him. He's changing it to the Jews, and that is theological anti-Judaism. He would like Messianic Jews not to be somehow not real Jews. They're sort of not Jews. Remember, he's writing after the terrible war of 66 to 74, when if you are kind of Roman and Jewish, you're kind of embarrassed by which are you. And I see Luke, as you probably know, as a God worshiper, a God-fearer.
What is the apocalypse and the pornography of violence?
Oh. One of the best ways to read the book of Revelation, I actually did this. And when I'm working, I'm usually writing on my computer, and I have a marvelous program. I won't mention it because I'm not pushing anything, but I can flip in and see the English text or the Greek text, or if it's an Old Testament, the Hebrew text, right there next to where I'm writing. So, for example, when I was working on the book of Revelation, if I came to the word blood, I immediately went into my, as it were, concordance, put in blood, and I'd see how often it comes up in the book of Revelation. And I just copied that out, put it in a separate file, and looked at it. Here's the way blood is mentioned again and again and again. And I just studied all the texts. I didn't have them in context. That's why I said it was a wash in blood. The theme that I argued for the book of the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, is this. In the past, the scholarly consensus, and that's the one I grew up with, the scholarly consensus was this book was written under Domitian in the 90s, and it reflects intense Roman persecution, that would be programmatic Roman persecution on the imperial level as policy in the program of Christianity. That's why it speaks of Rome slaughtering. I'm using the word slaughtering Christians. Looks like heaven is almost filled with martyrs. And therefore, God and Christ are returning to slaughter Romans. That's the theme of the book of Revelation. And it seems almost like it's fair. They slaughtered us, God will slaughter them. Now, what has happened recently, in the last maybe decade, scholars have begun to say again and again, and I think they're right, there is no evidence whatsoever that the mission ever persecuted as policy and program Christians. Ain't no evidence. And I would add, there's evidence against it, because Ignatius of Antioch, traveling in the early 2nd century under control to go to Rome to be put to death, passes through the same area, and he never mentions persecution to any of these churches. He's more worried about whether they're obeying their bishop. And in the same way, Pliny the Younger, writing back from Bithynia around the same time, beginning of the 2nd century, about 115, has to write to Trajan and say, I've run into these weirdos, they're called Christians, and kind of, what do I do with them? And this is the most erudite, well plugged in aristocrat in the Roman Empire, and he doesn't know that the mission ran a persecution against these people. I would say it just ain't true. So now that leaves us with a huge explanation. I mean, scholarship isn't doing too good at this at the moment. That's why I had to answer it myself. If the mission, if the Roman Empire did not slaughter Christian as program and policy, why does he say that? Why does he make it so pornographic? Rome is, as you know, the city of Rome is the great brothel of the Mediterranean. They use more polite language. It's the brothel of the Mediterranean. Of course, everyone's coming and going, and the merchants are simply being seduced by prostitution, he says. It's not just that Rome is violent. It's not just that Rome is pornographically evil and doomed, because Roman imperialism is actually Mediterranean globalization. Business. The business of the empire is business. And therefore, you will find far more, you'll find nothing in all of the book of Revelation about the legions. Where are the legions? That's Roman power. He talks only about the merchants. It's like he's picking on the merchants, because the legions are about oppression. The merchants are about attraction. It's the attraction of the brothel against the oppression, as it were, of the army. So what John of Patmos wants to do is, don't even think of Rome. Don't have anything to do with it. Come out of her, my people. Don't have anything to do with it. No business with Rome. Nothing to do with Rome. It's evil. It's cruel. It's doomed. Don't have anything to do with it. This is the manifesto of sort of not just non-serviam. I will not serve. I will not even cooperate. But I have nothing to do with it. Don't even live in it, as it were. So my answer to the scholarly problem of Revelation at the moment, and it is a scholarly problem, and I don't know anyone else who has answered it. If there has not been slaughter, programmatic, by the Roman Empire, why bother telling a lie? You know, if you're interested in using truth, the lost art of telling the truth, to say that is a lie. And we know that Jesus is coming back soon to slaughter the Romans is at least a mistake. So what is John up to? What's his purpose? What's the authorial intention, the literary purpose, the rhetorical strategy of the book of Revelation? It's not enough to say I don't like it or I like it or whatever, or postpone it into the future, because we can always do that.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Crossan.
As always, a pleasure, Jacob. Good to be with you.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.